Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. If you're learning to draw the figure, especially for comics or manga or concept art or some type of stylized application where we're exaggerating things and making them cool and interesting, one of the biggest challenges is learning how to control proportion in 3 dimensions, especially as we draw the figure from different angles and we morph the figure and pose it in different positions. There's a number of foundational concepts that we can use to improve our ability to draw with structure and maintain this proportion. And what I want to do in this video is a simple drawing lesson covering how to apply those basic concepts to this task of maintaining proportion and solidarity within the figure as we pose it. So let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome again to the Drawing Codex. On this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you want to learn more about line and color illustration, you can check out my free quick start guide that goes over my tips and advice for creating your own simple, reliable process in Photoshop. This is the same process and the same advice that I use to create line and color illustrations for comics or concept art every day in my own career. This quick start guide is free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. So I use these concepts every day as a working artist. I've been a working artist for over 20 years and I draw comics and concept art pretty much all day, every day. And it's really important to understand, obviously, your foundation. What we're typically dealing with as we try and control proportion with a figure, right? So if we sort of take the example of a figure, right, here we have a figure, and often what we're doing is just a lot of simple tasks done well and accurately, but repeated and done over and over again. So drawing is not necessarily some crazy complex thing, and drawing the figure is the same. It's not ridiculously complicated, even though it has lots of literal moving parts. The trick is to do all of the basic things consistently and not to make any major mistakes. And typically what you'll find is that if you can manage to do that, a lot of your drawings will turn out pretty well. The trick is that is a huge challenge. Now, the reason for that is, as you can see, this figure is kind of moving in 3-dimensional space, and your job as an artist is to figure out how to line up all of these points with the anatomy and sort of keep them consistent. Now, the thing is that it's the exact same challenge that you would have if you were to draw a basic geoform, and that's why often foundational sort of art education involves a lot of drawing these kinds of things. For the simple reason that if you can learn how to control proportion with a simple form, that gives you the formula that you need to use for a very, very complicated form. But the problem is with that type of education is often it's a matter of we do a lot of this before we can do this. And I think that can be very challenging, especially if you're just kind of wanting to draw, again, manga or comics or something really exciting. So I think in many ways, your task is to kind of get to a point where this becomes really interesting. And until it becomes really interesting, you're probably better off, again, trying to think about these concepts in slightly different ways. So that's a big part of what I want to do in this little drawing lesson demonstration is talk about how we can maybe learn some of these concepts and understand why they're so important as we are drawing the figure. Now, again, hopefully you can kind of understand the basic sort of theoretical concept here is that, again, as the figure moves in 3 dimensions, often what we're trying to do is just control proportion. And it's the same here with this figure as it is with the cube. So we can demonstrate and think about a lot of the things, and that's what I'll be doing here, that we kind of end up applying to the figure. But it's basically the same idea. That's what most of drawing is. Most of drawing is actually just proportion and controlling proportion in 3-dimensional space, especially if you have like a desire to create a representational or, highly dimensional drawing style. So this is the basic idea, right? We have to be able to control the three-dimensional space a little bit and kind of understand what angles things are at and how we kind of make things look square, make things look symmetrical. So there's a couple of base concepts that we'll be talking about. The first is the idea of a center line, which is one of the things that we are often putting in. Now, the reason that this is so important, and the other thing that was really important here, is the concept of symmetry or mirroring. And that's because often when we're drawing the figure, as with a lot of things, they're symmetrical. So we're kind of created with this kind of basically symmetrical physicality. And what that means is that drawing the same thing mirrored from side to side and controlling that proportion is a key part of making figures look like figures. We can all sort of see if, someone's really bent out of shape, if they're not symmetrical in some major way. It really sort of jumps out at us. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is understand how to control symmetry, how to use a center line, and then how to sort of think about how we can simplify the process of rotating figures and forms in three-dimensional space. So it's a really complicated subject, and I don't want to kind of say, look, just learn to do this, because if you learn to do this, then you can do this. Because that's not entirely true as well. I know lots of people who are very good at drawing cubes and they still can't draw people. The trick is to, again, understand how this is very useful for explaining basic concepts, and also to appreciate the general complexity of this task. Just figuring out how to do all of these things, maintain proportion, think about perspective, think about your camera angle, do all of these things at once is very complicated. But I think it's possible, and that's what we'll share in this video, to kind of think about what are the most basic and most important elements of those foundational concepts that we use repeatedly when it comes to drawing. The other concept that is critical for you to grasp is that as much of the perspective that we might talk about is important, often when we're actually drawing, when I'm drawing day in, day out, I'm guesstimating. And my ability to guesstimate sort of where arms are or where features of the face are when the character's face is kind of turned, my ability to kind of say, oh, okay, like the face is turned here, so that means, there's going to be an eye here and an eye here, and, there's like a center line along my face. My ability to guesstimate those things has been built over a career that involves a lot of sort of technical exercise. But my implementation of it and your goal is basically to just get better at guessing where stuff goes and sort of thinking in three dimensions and kind of spotting when stuff doesn't look like it's in perspective. And there's a lot of very fundamental exercises we can do while we practice drawing the figure and do some fun stuff that will allow us to learn about those foundational principles of perspective at the same time. So that's what we've got in store in this demonstration and little drawing lesson. Let's jump over to the drawing table and we'll unpack this with a little bit more practicality. We're actually drawing some cool stuff. All right, so here we are at the drawing table. Now for this demonstration, I am sketching in a Strathmore 400 series sketchbook, which is similar to this one. Just in case you're sort of wondering, this is the 400 series recycled sketch paper. So good for sketching, playing around, probably not good for doing hyper detailed finished illustrations because the paper will kind of collapse after a while. I'm going to be doing this demonstration with a matte Blackwing pencil, and I normally use a kneadable eraser if I'm sort of trying to take stuff off subtly, or I'll just use the eraser on the back of the Blackwing. As I've said in sort of some of these previous videos, I mainly use this Blackwing because it's quite dark and shows up well on the demos. If I'm just drawing for myself, I might use a slightly sort of harder, lighter pencil so that, again, it just doesn't require so much sharpening. Now, I do use these concepts all the time, and this is one of those things where, again, as my sort of career progressed, I got better and better at this. Now, I like to use this Capcom Design Works as a good example of the type of figure work where we are exaggerating and we're drawing cool stuff that has, like a manga comics vibe, but there's still good drawing, right? We're still drawing with solidarity. Again, you may be looking to draw in a slightly different style. That's totally cool, but I find this is just a really good sort of reference so we can sort of look at some stuff and talk about it, because it has heaps of cool poses and a lot of sort of foreshortening where the artists are actually manipulating the figure in 3 dimensions quite well. So we'll refer back to this, and again, I like to use this as a good example of some sort of aspirational art that I think has a good sense of character, solidarity, good drawing, etc., etc. So anyway, we use this, but just to go over again, the practical implementations of this. Again, even if you're using quite a simplified style, like the sort of style I used for one of the first comics I ever drew, the 7 Pirates comic. Again, when we're drawing the figure, even if it's sort of simplified, a lot of what we're doing is being able to rotate and think about where the hands are, where the figure is, and maintain proportion as we sort of draw it from slightly different angles. Now, really the concept and logic is no different if you're just drawing figures that are from, slightly, exaggerated angles, right? In many cases, depending on what style of sort of comics or art you're creating, you might just be dealing with many cases of figures who are just kind of standing in quite natural positions and postures. So it doesn't have to be just, trying to create crazy splash screen style art that you need to really, really be able to control proportion. Even if you're just doing concept art and you're basically just trying to control proportion of characters that are kind of just standing upright, you still need to be able to use these basic concepts. The trick to, having very, very exaggerated, crazy poses, again, like the sort of stuff you'd see in the Capcom design works, is just that we're applying the same basic concepts, but we're just getting used to doing it as we manipulate the figure. Now, there's quite a few things that go into this as you sort of exaggerate and try and pick crazy, interesting poses that are worth thinking about, and we'll sort of cover them in a little bit more detail in the actual drawing lesson. But it's really important to mention, and I kind of want to mention this up front, is that not all poses are good. So as you're doing these exercises and trying to think about like, oh, hey, I want to draw this cool pose, and my drawing still sucks a bit, and it's really hard to control proportion. Just keep in mind that not all poses that you can draw are good. Just because you can draw a pose in a particular way and make it accurate doesn't mean it's going to look good. A good way to think about this is if you have ever been to life drawing, where you have to draw like a naked live model, or someone who, sometimes they have like sort of dress up versions of that. But either way, those actors who are doing the life drawing will have a couple of set poses, right? They might have a repertoire of maybe, it might be quite a few, it might be like 20 or 30 poses that they know how to do. But some poses are better than others. And if you've ever been to life drawing and you're trying to draw a model, right, who's sort of up on a dais or stand or something like that, and sometimes you just get a dud view, right? Sometimes like the pose is good because they've got this dynamic pose, but you're just at the wrong angle from it, and it's not dimensional. It's hard to figure out what's going on. You're doing a whole bunch of foreshortening, drawing a leg or something like that, coming right at you with heaps of foreshortening, and there's no payoff. It's not a good angle. So always remember that. Just because you can draw it doesn't mean it's good. Just because you can do it accurately doesn't mean it's good. You have to pick a good angle as well. And that's where, again, a lot of these simpler postures, even though we're trying to, make them accurate, they kind of work because they're very basic, they're well sort of staged, and they're clear, right? So clarity of the posture, clarity of what you're trying to do is really important. And it's not a matter of like the more exaggerated the pose, the better. Now, what you're seeing when you see, again, like a lot of these kind of heavily foreshortened, like awesome looking drawings, is heavy selection, right? It's a heavy selection of angles and postures and things that kind of work well. And it's important to remember that. And as you maybe try and play with your ability to control proportion, to also remember to pick poses that you kind of know will work, because that means a lot of the hard work is already done for you. This is one of the things that took me the longest time to learn, right? Just because I could draw it and make it solid didn't mean that it would naturally look good. And sometimes things would look bad and be a failed drawing, even if I sort of drew it pretty well, right? So my drawing ability would be like, it's okay, right? Even when I was sort of, doing my first professional work, my drawing was like, look, it was not the best, right? I've gotten better since then. But, I could draw poses where, I still got it pretty accurate, but it looked garbage, right? It didn't look good. It didn't feel good. And then I do other drawings where, because the drawing was staged better, and by staging, I just mean the angle of it, right? Like the angle that it was positioned in, right? It was just clear, it was dynamic, the posture was good. And even if I didn't do a great job of drawing it, the drawing still read well. It was easy to see the solidarity there. The other thing is that, again, if you are doing heavy foreshortening or, trying to sort of put a lot of exaggeration on things, you sort of have to, practice doing that. The crazy foreshortening is its own task in and of itself. And the other thing is you've got to really know that it's worthwhile you pursuing some crazy sort of exaggerated pose. It really has to resonate with who the character is and what they're doing and be worth it. Because otherwise, again, what you'll find is you'll be drawing it well, but it just won't feel good, right? It just won't actually pay off for all your hard work. Now, if you're looking at, again, the sort of classical drawing educational stuff that sort of deals with proportion, often what you're sort of looking at is similar to what I was saying before, where you're dealing with an artist sort of explaining to you how to think about the figure from this sort of structural standpoint, where we are considering the foreshortening. We're considering that we have this kind of contour lines wrapping over everything. And basically, this is the thing that has been repeated again and again and again. It's just think about it as if it is a basic shape, and that helps you to think about easily controlling proportion. Now, it's not easy, it's just sort of easier, right? It makes it simpler. But if you're looking for the elements that sort of discuss these concepts in traditional drawing books, like Andrew Loomis's Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, which again I often reference for this purpose, then these are the kind of concepts that are going to really help us, because they talk about how to simplify the form and control those things. And Andrew Loomis also talks quite a lot about some of these other concepts here. So drawing the mannequin from any viewpoint. This is where, again, we're thinking about how to control that proportion and that sort of perspective, right? So again, it's a very similar concept to what we've got here. We've got a box, right? And if you can think about how to draw that box, and then you can link the concept of a figure to that box, it makes this easier. You've probably seen a lot of people talking about this basic idea, and that's because it underpins much of structural drawing technique. Now, I guess, as with a lot of the advice that I give, it's important to understand that the people who are drawing these, right, and using this as a demonstration of like, hey, look how the figure fits within a box. It's super important. But what these drawings demonstrate is not necessarily the process that the artist is using to derive this figure in the first place. It is an explanation of what their sort of thought process is, and how they're trying to describe how, hey, look, you see how this is just simply in perspective, right? And these things kind of line up with each other and stuff. That's kind of what you got to do. But don't make the mistake that because people draw boxes around everything, that you have to draw boxes around everything as well. Again, it can be good as an exercise, but this is just a demonstration of how you can apply simple mirroring and perspective concepts to a figure and use that to help you control proportion. So again, you can sort of see here, again, a good example of what's being done is this plane is being divided in half. And if you look at the basic mannequin or anatomical proportion, we remember that the sort of bottom of the crotch area is going to line up basically with kind of like halfway up the figure. So if you can just kind of divide that proportion, then that gives you a really good indication again of sort of where the bottom of that pelvis should be. And it's just a matter of extrapolating that idea upwards and upwards with more and more complexity. And that's really all we do. But as I said, it's easy to explain these concepts. The trick is you have to understand how to apply them to your drawing. And again, the key there is often this is a visualization of the process that's happening within the artist's mind. And your job is to kind of understand some of this perspective and structural drawing, practice some of these concepts so that you're able to actually engage your intuition and do many of these things without drawing silly boxes over everything. So just remember that. Again, this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. If you're looking at books, again, yes, this is very valuable. As with all of these drawing exercises, this is just an artist trying to explain to you how they kind of control proportion in 3 dimensions and the concept of it, right? So again, you can see that kind of happening, but it's not the suggestion necessarily that you have to follow this and always be drawing boxes around everything, right? That's not really how it works. But anyway, let's jump in and we'll start drawing and see how we can apply these concepts and maybe draw out a few key things that are really, really worth working on when you're practicing your figures to help you get better at this. All right, so for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is focus more on the figure being a little bit more static. I might do an additional video going over, again, how we apply some of these concepts to a figure that is, posed in a much more dynamic way. But for now, what I want to do is cover the basics that you can go away and use to implement in your own drawing. And a lot of these things, again, can be learnt just from drawing the figure in a fairly static pose. The first concept is the idea of the center line. And the center line is something that will help us gauge proportion in 3 dimensions. So if we think about the idea of a center line for a head, which again is not really what we're sort of doing here, but this will be a good demonstration and we'll sort of move on to the figure next. The center line again is the division down the center of the face. If we've got a little sort of skull here, again the center line is where we draw and divide, obviously straight down the middle of the face there. And the goal here is to help us understand 2 things. One is to understand from a dimensionality standpoint what is happening with the profile view of whatever we're drawing. So if we look from the side and we maybe have the character, right, again, just from a super simple standpoint, what we're trying to deal with is this line. Right, it's this dimensionality, right, where again the center of the nose goes out, right, this goes there, got an eye here. So it's this center line, and it does a few things. Again, the first is this, right, it allows us to represent and track the dimensionality of that object when we sort of think about it from as if it's viewed from the side. The other thing that it does is it allows us to mirror and measure across that axis. And the best way to sort of describe that concept is if, again, we sort of flatten it out and go back to box logic. So if we can think about a boring, simple box, right, that we can kind of draw in 3 dimensions, again just being rough. Now what the center line of the box does is, again, it allows us, all right, let's get our eraser, just make sure we're sort of super clear because the center line of that is kind of lining up with that back face. So here we've got the center line of the box, and what that's doing is sort of giving us symmetry, right? And at its most basic level, what it allows us to kind of say is that, we can sort of line stuff up like those eyes. And even if we're just guesstimating, right, if I'm just kind of putting in a thing like, oh, maybe there's like a little nose on there, right, and there's an eye here and an eye here, you can see that just having that center line, right, and being able to sort of track that proportion from side to side, right, allows me to better gauge the symmetry. So we can see this as being an absurdly simplified block man, or creature or thing, whatever it is. And this gives us, again, the second use of the center line, which is if we put it in, we can then either physically sort of divide up this space. So, you see here I used the simple trick of, in 2 dimensions, dividing up this figure. Again, that's not need to do that more accurately. Yeah, if you don't do it accurately, if you don't actually draw from corner to corner, it won't be symmetrical. But yeah, in 2 dimensions, obviously, if I use that simple logic of sort of drawing the cross, it then gives me an easy indication of how to symmetrically break up that sort of set of proportions. And again, you can follow that same logic ad infinitum to divide up the space. And what that means is that in 2 dimensions, if we sort of have the center line in the same way in 3 dimensions, it allows us to figure out symmetry and find points. Now, you might be saying, please stop, because that's super boring and technical. And I'm like, yep, I kind of agree, right? Doing this stuff is kind of boring. As I said, it's dry to think about this. Another way to view the entire concept of art education, all of these things, is that often what we're sort of trying to do, right, is a little bit more like this. I'm going to sort of roughly draw, a face shape. And what I want to do is kind of put some eyes, right? And I want to sort of put some eyes on there. And again, they might be, right, they might be, might be something a little bit sort of cuter, right? Often what I'm trying to do is we're just trying to sort of roughly place some eyes or some sort of features on the face or on whatever we're drawing. And this is where, again, what you'll find is that center line really helps. So you can see here I'm drawing something that's a little bit more some sort of goblin-y sort of creature or something like that. But again, what I'm doing is I'm sort of finding that dimensionality. I'm finding the center line, right? And normally what I'm going to do is kind of actually sort of rough in maybe where some sort of eyes go. Right, and now we maybe have sort of a nose or something like that. And again, I've sort of found the mouth, so what I'm going to do is kind of do the same thing, right? Like here's the eyes, right? Let's sort of draw some contour lines, and that allows me to kind of figure out where some different things would be. Now, I'm also using these lines in perspective, which is something that we'll sort of cover as we sort of go. But again, I'm thinking about the same thing. So basically, often when we're drawing, what we're doing is kind of taking this solid version of things, right? This kind of boring, I don't know where my, here's my cube. Yeah, we're taking this boring thing and we're kind of just mushing it over or bending it onto much more sort of organic forms. Sorry, it's getting a bit blurry, right? So it's basically this is the same as this. It's just that this is more complicated and more organic. Often what we're doing is we're applying the thinking here, but I'm kind of doing it more with sort of contour lines and form, right? But the idea of finding that center line of proportion and then being able to either measure or guesstimate or just sort of sense or use my intuition to think about where the different features are along that is going to be sort of super important. So the trick is, this is the outcome for me anyway, and probably for you again if you're sort of trying to figure out how to draw stuff from your imagination. The outcome is that we're able to draw in a more organic way, and what we're doing is building our ability to, sure, put in some of these form lines, put in some of these gesture lines and, contour lines and stuff. But mostly what we're after is just being able to kind of draw, use our intuition, and guesstimate where some of these forms go. The trick is, the easiest way for you to kind of learn that, if you're kind of not really getting this and this is sort of struggling, and maybe you sort of try and put in some of those concepts and then It's like, your drawings kind of suck, right? It's just everything's a bit wobbly. That certainly happened for me. Now, the trick is, the more you practice this basic sort of version of it, right, as an exercise, what you'll find, the more your accuracy here will seep into your accuracy here. This is just a function of educating and improving the subconscious mind. Your ability to kind of make these kind of accurate marks, and you saw that me do that, right? I was kind of like, oh yeah, you just kind of do a thing, and then like, you kind of just, and it's like, bow, right? This is wrong. So, and you saw me do that initially, and what's happening there is my accuracy that I really need to divide up space properly was mismatched. So my expectation of accuracy, my physical ability to, oh, you see there again, I need to move that a little bit that way. My physical ability to actually make the line was not sufficient to actually have any expectation of this working, right? And that's really, really important. And what that means is that essentially often the basic mistakes that you're making when you try and draw very basic two-dimensional faces and match proportion, the mistakes you're making here very well likely are going to be made here. And if you can practice here and make sure at least you're doing this right and get a feel for like, okay, I really got to think about how to divide up space, how to make sure my sort of, eyes are, not like warped and sort of twisted and in the wrong spot. That at least is kind of telling you the pace, the speed, the accuracy, the thought that's probably required to do the same thing here. And again, it's a mix of things, but that certainly is something that's worth thinking about. And you don't have to spend your whole life doing these kind of boring exercises, but just doing a little bit of it and just practicing doing some sort of division, where we find, again, these sort of center lines, we try and find symmetry, can be really, really useful. Now, you don't have to do it with blocky thing. You can try a mix of doing the blocky version, right? Or, again, just kind of, trying to find those forms and trying to find some sort of dimensionality there, and utilize the same sort of concepts, but with more gesture, more, I guess, sort of fun, natural, artistic drawing style. But what I'm doing here is very, very similar to what I'm doing with the blocky thing. I'm just kind of drawing organic shapes and thinking about where the center line of those things are, which is exactly the same thing we have to do when we're tackling the figure. Often what we're doing is thinking about, again, the center line of the rib cage. I'm thinking about where the sort of collarbone goes, and I'm trying to line these things up in three-dimensional space. So controlling three-dimensional space is also important. But yeah, as I said, if we think about where some of these sort of lines are, it's the same concept that I would use here again as I would use here in the face, or as we would use if we are thinking about, where proportion goes on the face or the figure, right? So here I've got the figure. Again, not particularly good or interesting figure, but it's this concept of thinking about that center line, right? Thinking about that center line, thinking about where it goes, where the dimensionality of it is, that will kind of help me. So even if, again, here we haven't even really got onto posing, but we're just dealing with some very, very simple concepts. And these are, as you can see in these kind of demonstrations, are very similar. So these three concepts, I guess, are the things that we really have to pay attention to and figure out how you understand them best. Again, the way you understand this might be just through a little bit more organic form, right? It might be more about drawing jelly beans, sort of spheres, and again, trying to place, symmetrical points across center lines. The first concept there, again, just to sort of formalize this and so we can kind of remember, the first concept is the center line, right? Thinking about where the symmetry basically begins and ends. The second is the concept of symmetry itself. Again, I think that's how you spell symmetry. Or the other way we can sort of view this is mirroring. Again, not sure whether that's how you spell mirroring either. But the third thing is just controlling this proportion in 3 dimensions, which is a fairly amorphous concept, but it's basically the mix of understanding center line and mirroring, and then understanding, okay, we can also apply these concepts in 3 dimensions. Now, as I said, okay, let's just form this in proportion in 3D. So just understanding your sort of basic proportions there will really help. That's proportion in 3 dimensions, which is, as I said, it's just taking these concepts of the center line, symmetry, and turning it into a 3-dimensional object that we can then, actually make into something. All right, so let's look at how this might apply to the figure, or especially, again, like a blocky sort of mannequin version of the figure, because that's probably better to learn with and understand these concepts of proportion. So if we stick with our kind of mannequin version of the figure, that actually allows us to better control proportion, and this is often how we actually go about sketching out the figure and figuring out how this works anyway. Now, the basic concept, or a good way to kind of think about how you might learn this, is just to kind of think about the separate elements of that mannequin or of your kind of base figure that again goes through to make up the more complicated figure. Those things are just sort of individual objects. So that's the advantage of thinking about the mannequin in this way, as being made up of sort of separate objects. So if we kind of look at the concept again, it's often broken down into the idea of that simple wooden mannequin. And the wooden mannequin sort of doesn't change with muscles moving over other muscles. But this is the trick to controlling proportion, is to control proportion with sort of more static objects in the beginning. So if we think about the torso area as a concept here, again, I'll do a different video, like actually demonstrating how we sort of might apply this to some interesting poses in the future. But if we think about the torso as essentially from a primary form perspective being this kind of egg shape, and the things that we need to do are to sort of find the general dimensionality of that, so that we can then place in the pelvic sort of version of that mannequin stick figure, and then place the arms. So this is really the problem that we start to deal with, is kind of how do we break this down? Now remember, I said drawing well or drawing accurately, which is something, again, I'm aspiring to do here as much as possible with these demonstrations, but things are generally sort of pretty rough. But drawing in a really solid way and getting everything kind of correct is mostly a matter of doing a lot of basic things that you probably already know and can probably already do. We just have to do lots of them stacked on top of each other. So that's typically how we can break down these problems and just get used to handling the complexity that is the human figure. The points that we have to deal with are these points of the shoulder that are kind of going to be symmetrical, right? So if we think about this as the thing we're trying to draw, again, I've probably drawn this torso a little bit sort of big here, but we can correct that as we go. But we've got these kind of points that are the articulation points of the skeleton within the figure there. And those are the proportional points we're trying to control. That's why we break down the mannequin this way. And again, as I said, what we have to think about is controlling that proportion, right? Thinking about the plane that makes up that measurement. This is why people keep going on about planes and boxes and things, right? So this is sort of what we're trying to think about, is these points in space. Now, you don't have to always measure them out. You really rarely measure them out. But what I have to do is get good at kind of thinking about drawing, firstly, the torso, right? So the trick here is, again, break this down into as many elements as you can and get good at doing it, and then try and sort of combine them. But again, practice combining them often and soon. You don't want to just get good at this. But you don't want to just get good at drawing torsos and then forget about the rest. We need to apply them all. But breaking it down helps. So the first thing would be, let's think about controlling proportion and the center line and mirroring within this kind of egg shape of the torso. Right, so we've got our sort of torso here. Right. Again, can be a little bit tricky to understand if you're not used to looking at these kind of form drawing things, but that's basically what I'm trying to represent. Right, here's the torso. Then if we kind of think about where it is, right, and line stuff up, then it becomes easy to kind of guesstimate where these shoulder points are. Now, all I'm doing there by sort of placing those shoulders is just literally thinking about, we've got a sphere at its sort of more primary form level. And then you can kind of imagine, if we were to sort of look at that from above, there's just kind of a plane going through that sphere, right? All right, so it's kind of like as if we have a bit of wood, and out of the wood is kind of sticking a basketball or something. Now, on that plane, we are just visualizing two dots, and you just get better and better at visualizing them. And again, you can do that by measuring, or you can just do it by eye, right? Like keep trying to think about where this torso is. Right, so here I've got, again, my sort of what should be much more of an egg-shaped torso. I keep making it sort of spherical for simplicity, right? So I've got that, and then I'm thinking about how to line stuff up, right? And I'm placing these points, if that makes sense. And, you know, you just get better and better at trying to place them, and you get better and better at kind of saying, well, yeah, you know, maybe that's a little bit far that way. Maybe it's a little bit far this way. If you really want to work on this and you're sort of struggling placing these points around the shop, then the trick is that the more you study your classical perspective, the better your guesstimation here will be. But you can still implement your guesstimation at any point in time, and it'll be basically as good as it can be. Now, the reason I'm sort of going on about this torso is all the other problems in the figure are essentially exactly the same as this, just with different bits and pieces, right? So the other sort of proportional challenges you would have would be, okay, you know, at the bottom of this torso, we kind of have our pelvic area of our sort of mannequin, or whatever you want to call that, which essentially is just representing, right, that sort of torso. And then from a skeletal standpoint, and you can kind of see it here, right, we've sort of got these plates representing the pelvis, and then we've got the hip bone, and then we got these bones here. Now, part of the good thing, and the reason I really like the Loomis sort of drawing version of this, is he puts a lot of spring into these sort of figures, and gives the mannequin itself a little bit of life, which again you can do too. But again, it's going to be a similar thing. We've got these two plates, and then we've got these sort of two dots that are kind of off that represent the hip bones. And again, you kind of have to line them up, think about where the center line is, and then draw the legs down from there. And mostly what you're trying to do is, again, especially when you're sort of just trying to control proportion, is you're just trying to control the size and mirroring of these points across. Again, proportion is kind of like a little bit off, right? A little bit sort of flaky here, but the general idea is there. So this concept of saying, well, I've got sort of a blob of stuff in the center, right? I need to define the, I need to define the center of that, and I need to figure out, where these other elements are relative to that. This is just all we're doing. And if you can do it with one thing, it's just a matter of applying the same concept, the same logic, the same success you've had there to all the other things. And again, the more you can manipulate and draw these different little bits and pieces from different angles, the better you can figure out how to kind of pose the figure. Now, obviously, putting all this together and thinking about gesture and posture and all these kind of things is tricky, but these are the core concepts that we want to take away, that if you work on, should be able to be applied to your drawing all day, every day. Now, this is a small subset of all technical drawing, etc., etc., but these are the things that you'll find are actually going to make an appreciable difference and get you sort of interested in it. So again, it's the same concept. And as I said, it's just a matter of, thinking about this concept of, our sort of torso egg, right? The dimensionality of it. Right, here we've got the same thing, similar to this, maybe a little bit, right? A bit further, and again, all I'm doing is sort of just basically thinking about a line going here, just a stick going here. I'm trying to think about where the center of it might be, and then I'm sort of just guesstimating that distance, which is very similar to this exercise you can do, which is to just kind of practice, right, drawing and getting things symmetrical. Now, a good way you can actually practice that is just to sort of think about, okay, I've got a stick, right? I've got sort of a line that represents sort of some space in perspective, right? Again, just to sort of help visualize what's sort of going on here. And then what I'm going to do is try and place in some of these proportional markers, right? So again, that would be, got our sort of rib cage there, all right? That's going to duck down, and then under here we're going to have, again, that pelvis, right? And then we might have, again, right, an arm here, whatever it is. Again, this is not a great drawing, just hopefully there. So hopefully you get the idea. Again, doing drawing demonstrations, trying to make the proportion accurate, make it interesting, make it a cool pose, explain things at the same time is kind of challenging. So, which is why often the drawings that I do when I'm doing these end up being a little bit sort of static and the same. But it's the same concept, right? We're just stacking these ideas. Now, you can try to do that by saying, let's just draw some lines, right? And we'll sort of pick a center line or a center point, right? And then we'll think about, where the perspective is, and sort of see if we can, think about, right, like where the dimensionality of that is, and how close we are to getting that accurate. So again, a lot of this is just about kind of feel, right? You're feeling these dimensional sort of changes, and again, you're trying to sort of see, like, does that line up? Or at least get a feel for what type of angle of sort of box or plane that we're drawing does this feeling of this relationship between these kind of three dots, i.e. center, and then two symmetrically placed points, which again just comes back to understanding where's the center, and then depending on the angle, right, where are 2 points that are symmetrical on the figure going to be placed in 3 dimensions, i.e. on the page. So it's these little challenges that we work with, and we get better at guessing, and we get better at sort of doing, that help us control proportion. There really is no extra trick to it. That's kind of what we're doing. Now, if you twist the figure, right, it's just a matter of sort of thinking about these different objects or different elements of the figure being in different positions or orientations in space. So if we think about, again, once you sort of start to take this to the next level often what we're doing is kind of saying, well, right, I've got my egg shape here, right? We're sort of looking at the back of a character, right? We're looking from above. We've got like a face here or something like that. Again, just being super rough. And we've got a center line here, right, which sort of gives me, again, maybe this is sort of going through the center there, so maybe the center of it within that figure is kind of there. And I'm just going to sort of guesstimate, you know, some sort of position here. Again, I could do a better job of sort of guesstimating, or I could use some other things to kind of line up where it is. Or again, depending on, you know, where the shoulders are, that might sort of move around. Again, part of this is kind of visualizing, right? If the character moves their, you know, their arms sort of down, this whole shoulder area is going to morph and sort of come down to about there. So again, there's a lot of organicness to this, but understanding where, you know, a point or a, you know, an element of anatomy sort of should be if it was a little bit more static is a good way to kind of then sort of jump off of. But if we think about this, again, I've got my, right, so we might have a, right, this arm is kind of dropping down here, right, maybe this one is kind of up here. And again, I'm just moving these limbs out so they're kind of easy to see. So again, we're looking down at this character's back, right? But maybe let's, and this is again sort of classic, this looks a little bit like some sort of classic comic book sort of pose. Again, if I sort of move the head around, right? So now the head is kind of moving here. Again, firstly, this character now has a very long neck, which is a little bit unrealistic, but you get the idea. So all I'm doing is kind of drawing the head, right, as if it's kind of from this angle, eye, nose, right, and then I'm drawing the torso as if it's from, again, the sort of up and from the back. And again, what would kind of happen if this was all kind of lined up is that we'd have our hips here, right, and then legs here. But again, imagine that this character is kind of twisted so that the torso is sort of like this up here, but as it kind of moves around the, right, we get like a slight kind of twisting, right? So this is often what's kind of happening. So we still think about where the, right, where that kind of space is going to be, but maybe again, this is kind of, right, this is kind of twisting a little bit. So again, that's sort of tricky to see, which again, a lot of these things are a little bit sort of tricky to see when we're sort of demonstrating, because they involve drawing through, right? But again, if we sort of think about our sort of, you know, your typical, people often describe this as like a, right, sort of like a jelly bean shape, right? But again, same concept, right? So basically in that case, what we're doing is we're sort of drawing the pelvis, right, as if it's kind of more pointing at us, right? So here I've got the pelvis, and that's kind of pointing at us. And again, you know, we might have, right, like an arm, a leg going out here. Again, we're going to do with sort of silly sort of poses. Again, remember, not just because you can draw it doesn't mean the pose is good or makes sense or anything like that, right? And then we have this one going here, right? Some sort of crazy interpretive dance pose or whatever, right? So as we're sort of twisting and controlling proportion, it's really just a matter of paying attention to, like, overall, where are we looking at this sort of character from, and just controlling and thinking about some of these basic ideas, as I said, where we sort of have mass, and then we have, right, kind of lines running through that mass. Good way to think about this is, again, you have sort of some ball or spherical object with kind of a pin through it, or a pencil kind of sticking through it, right? Literally like this. And we're just sort of going to mix those up. Now, again, like the head's going this way, the torso is sort of going a different way. And this is controlling proportion in 3 dimensions and sort of using these concepts to apply it to a figure. Now, making this figure feel like they would actually be in a particular position that makes sense is obviously a huge step forward from this. So firstly, if you're practicing these concepts, don't feel like, again, if your figure looks a bit awkward or stiff, that's a problem, right? That will happen. Your job here when we're talking about controlling proportion, as I often say, at its most basic level, is just being able to draw the figure, in just upright with no perspective at all. That's controlling proportion. As you start to move the figure in 3 dimensions and you're controlling proportion there as well, then don't expect things to look like they have heaps of life in the beginning. Just try control proportion, make it look good, make it look solid. And as you build your ability to gesture with the mannequin and sort of draw the mannequin and understand the weight and the balance, again, you start to put these things together, as long as you're actually applying it as you go. And, just trying to draw figures, try and draw them from weird angles. Again, the more you try the weird angle, the worse the figure's going to look, right? It's going to be stiff. It's going to feel funny. You can very much, get a huge benefit here from looking at movement studies, looking at reference for how people actually move, trying to sort of break that down into a mannequin here. Again, that's, it's something I haven't done a lot of that personally. But, that's something that can really help just kind of sync your brain up and start to think about what positions might be good. But at its core, this is all understanding proportion when we're drawing and we're sort of posing mannequins is about. We're often just dealing with the same simple task. And if we were to look at that from an even easier sort of vantage point, we can break it down to the concept of the box, right? So if we think about this as a box, right, I've got sort of 2 points and I've got a line running through it, right? Now, obviously, the bits of the box that we actually sort of draw in that case are going to be the stick there, right? The stick there, right? And again, the stick here. But this idea, right, of lining it up, of getting the dimensionality there, and again, then trying to, figure out, where these points in space, right, might lie, it's just all the same sort of drawing problem, right? We just need to kind of measure it out and think about those concepts. And as these things move, right, so do those points. And just, again, the better you sort of, again, that's weird. We got some arms coming out of the side of the rib cage there. Again, a little bit better if it's kind of here. And again, you get better at sort of guesstimating where those things are. The better, if you're sitting there going like, look, I've tried this and, I just placed these dots in the wrong spot. Again, what you'll find is the more of this technical stuff you do, the better this will get. So the more you sit there just kind of repeating, rinse, repeat, do these kind of like silly exercises where you divide, planes and boxes up, right? And then try and sort of gauge that proportion, right? Where you sort of think about how that proportion works in three-dimensional space. Now, again, it's probably going to be way more exaggerated as we have way more exaggerated perspectives. So we use the same concept, but we just break it down, right? And now we've got, again, right, symmetrical points, and you start to understand the cadence of like how these points move in three-dimensional space. But that basically, if you're looking for your sort of crazy, exaggerated, poses, it's often just a matter of doing, right, of doing these kind of crazy foreshortening things, right, and just sort of building up those forms in that way and understanding the center line. So hopefully that gives you an idea for the basics. Again, I'll do another video at some point in the future. You can check out on the Drawing Codex channel that goes over, we might try and do this, but actually build a figure on it and make it sort of interesting. Think about some of those other concepts. But this is really all we're doing. We're thinking about centerline, symmetry and mirroring, and then how to basically do that in 3 dimensions. The concept of practically applying that are really just a matter of sort of thinking, well, twisting and movement of the body is just manipulation of static objects with kind of muscle and organic stuff wrapped around it. So if you just practice drawing these things and understanding the basic forms that you're practicing in, by themselves, and kind of like how you draw them from different angles, thinking about the form drawing, which is very similar to your ability to draw sort of boxes or spheres, all this kind of boring stuff. If you practice that, and again, you don't have to get that good at it to start to see some implementation in your figures, but again, the better you get at it, the better your figures will get up. That's kind of how we start to build our understanding of how to manipulate these things. A big part of it also is just lining up bits and pieces. So doing these lines where again I'm constantly lining things up and creating these lines that kind of relate to the perspective grid, right? Thinking about the box logic of it and understanding that, again, when you're just drawing a face or something similar, right? And, we've kind of got our center line, right? A big part of, doing something basic like drawing some elven ears is to think about, well, where do those go on the other side? Right here I've got, we got a big sort of nose here, right? And I might sort of think about, right, where do those eyes go? I know that I've got a center line here. I've got the brow here, right? I've got some cheekbones here. Where's that other cheekbone over there? Like, let's try and sort of find it, right? Let's see what kind of looks good from a dimensional standpoint. And then you can kind of think about, well, I've got that point over there, right? I've got here my center line. This is kind of where the eye is probably going to start, because it kind of is typically going to line up with the side of the nose, right? So I'm probably going to get an eye, right, that's going to look, again, somewhere like that. And then you might think about, okay, now I want to put some eyebrows in, right? Maybe they kind of go up and they come down, right? And that means this one's going to come up, come down, and touch that same point, etc., etc. We're just going over the same thing, right? And we're finding points around, we're thinking about dimensionality and trying to find those center lines, etc., etc. So much of it is lining things up. And again, if you want to find those other elf ears, right, it's just a matter of sort of thinking about, well, the top of it kind of has to line up here, right? So maybe it's sort of, again, maybe it's there, somewhere like this, right? Again, or you can draw through and kind of say, well, that's the side of the face, right? Where does this other ear go? Again, to a certain degree, it's like, you can kind of draw this ear. You can draw this ear on the other side, and that will kind of tell you a lot about where this actually is in space, right? But if you have a pre-existing character and like, hey, if I look at from the top, right? Again, you'd have sort of eyes here, nose here, right? And these ears are kind of really poking that way, but they could also be, really far back this way, right? Or they could be out here. You don't know. But the way you kind of line them up and think about it is, again, understanding these through lines that are kind of, right, lining stuff up. And again, same thing if we want to draw some horns, right? You've got to sort of line them up and make sure they are hitting the same space. Typically, a lot of mistakes will happen just because people are kind of not doing that, and one eye is up here and one eye is there. So that, again, is a major part of controlling proportion. Lining things up, drawing these lines in space to kind of help us measure where one thing goes, right? Again, if we're sort of putting pectorals in, where the bottom of the pectoral is, I'm going to draw a line, right? Where the top is, right, I'm going to draw that line. I'm going to try and build that sort of figure, right? Where's that elbow go? Okay, let's draw a line down, right? Let's find that same point. Where's the hand? Well, again, let's draw a line down, right? Let's take that a line across, right? There's the hand. Okay, now I've got a basis, but that just putting that in as a rough helps me to, again, figure out the arcs of movement, maybe draw these arms in different positions. So that's happening all the time, lining up. Often the practical implementation of this is about guesstimating. So we do this technical analysis and we build our structural drawing ability so that I can just sort of say, hey, yeah, I'm kind of drawing, like a little character here, and I reckon there's an eye here and an eye here, right? There's sort of a nose here, and yeah, let's sort of, again, draw like a, a big sort of funny mouth there or something. We can do some sort of exaggerated kind of looks and stuff. But a lot of what I'm doing is just, just kind of drawing around, guesstimating. Oh yeah, that looks right. That, as I said, as I keep saying, is built upon a foundation of technical drawing, boring, grinding through these kind of exercises. Again, a little bit of this will go a long way. Now, again, what part of what you'll find in these kind of books is, again, mannequins and tips and tricks and things that will kind of help you memorize and understand where those proportional markers go. But the best thing to do is, again, to try and memorize them from a very static, front-on point of view first. That's where you can then, if you understand those and you really memorize them, that's where when we're drawing in 3 dimensions, you're less likely to make mistakes if at least you know how those things function from a very, very basic 2-dimensional standpoint. Again, a lot of proportion is understanding how 2 dimensions relates to 3 dimensions, right? What's the difference? What's the similarity between our kind of very basic version of this that's just front on versus the one that's heavily distorted? A few things quickly to note before we go. As I said, not all poses are good. You have to remember this. Your ability to make something look cool is based off your understanding of how to pick a good pose that is going to be dynamic. This is often why we do lots of little sketches to explore this and find a good one. Think about this as you having a library of good poses similar to the life models that I was talking about before. Not all life models who are, professional people who stand in front of artists naked are just kind of posing any old way. They're often practicing a pose they know looks good, has dimensionality, people have liked in the past, and that they can actually hold, right? And they have a repertoire, and it's the same for you. You have, your standard kind of, character sitting upright pose, and you build on it, and you build for you a few that you know as you go. If you look at a lot of these, examples of really cool poses and things, you kind of find that, there's a lot of repetition, and the reason there's a lot of repetition is because it works, and the artist has kind of figured out how to draw sort of interesting poses and kind of think about what works, and they're often, repeating that and drawing on a repertoire of things that are kind of repeated and honed over time. And again, don't expect yourself to just sort of knock it out of the park on the first go. You have to build your understanding of this in the beginning, which means, again, a really good place to start is with stuff works, stuff you've kind of seen before, and there's no problem with kind of copying some of those poses and trying to kind of understand why they work, because if you do that, it gives you the confidence to then start building the structure, and if you can kind of put all these things together, eventually you'll be able to come up with your own cool poses that look really natural, have lots of structure, and also look really, really cool. If you want some tips or exercises to kind of move your way through this, there's a couple of really basic sort of things. The first is keep it simple and work with progression. Again, start by just trying to draw the torso or something really, really simple, and then just move, like slowly try and manipulate it. Don't try and go from like, one simple perspective to like, hey, crazy, I'm going to draw it from a really, really exaggerated angle. The same thing with, again, trying these hyper exaggerated perspectives or whatever. Just stick to fairly reasonable manipulations of the figure to begin with. That'll really help you. Don't try, again, those sort of crazy Capcom, where there's like a fist coming sort of at you all the time. Don't try that stuff in the beginning if you're struggling with it. Keep it simple. And the other thing is try and work within the simplest version of a mannequin or version of your figure as possible, right? If you work up the simple mannequin and you try and sort of manipulate that, and by that I just mean, again, even if you don't want to sort of make it feel like it's even looking remotely human, right? Just stick with like a bowl for that sort of torso, right? And a bowl for the head, and just see if you can kind of make that sort of work. Again, don't worry too much about, adding sophistication to the pelvic area. Just think about it as if it's, like a cylinder or something, right? Just keep it as simple as possible. Even if it doesn't necessarily 100% represent the anatomy as well as a more sophisticated mannequin, the simpler you create it, the easier it's going to be for you to manipulate it. So keep it simple. The other thing I'd say is, again, often we have this goal to create these really awesome exaggerated poses. Again, one of the best things you can do is just to try and draw the standing figure, right? Just sort of standing figure here, right? We got, right, little, right, just this guy, or monster, or girl, or whatever you want, right? Just try and draw the standing figure, right? Standing there, doing nothing. And then maybe just try and rotate them, right? So just try and rotate them a little bit, and, try and move this around. Maybe, again, have them turning their torso a little bit, holding their arm in a different position. This will allow you to practice these things and still make sure you control proportion as you go. Again, the more you repeat the simple things, the easier it will be for you to tackle the more complicated things. Anyway, that's probably all we got time for today with this one. Thanks for hanging out and, checking out this, long drawing lesson. It was going to be sort of simple, but we ended up going, a little bit more in depth, which I think is cool. As I said, I will go into more depth trying to, apply these things, but these are the basics. These are the things that I think will help you the most. And if you really focus on these, I'm pretty confident it will help you to get your head around how to manipulate the figure in 3 dimensions. So anyway, that's all I've got for now. Check out the free quick start guide if you are interested in developing your own line and color style in Photoshop. But other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.